Hello, and welcome to the Brown People Podcast, because this is the first collective podcast where we've only had us brown folks on. So that's very exciting. It's a takeover. We are the antithesis to the ACP and to white supremacists all around the world and abroad. And speaking of takeover, so today's conversation we wanted to have is what's it like to be a first generation American and a communist, and how those things are connected to each other, and how we were radicalized through the struggle of being first generation American, its uniqueness separated from whiteness. I just think it would be a really cool conversation to have. I don't think we see enough of that happening here, especially, as we live in the imperial core, we live in the settler colony of the world. It's kind of remarkable how few people, I think, really think about this, particularly white people, particularly white communists, because they still sort of live with this default that the whiteness and Americana is the sort of default characteristic of what it's like to be a person, as opposed to really understanding that people come from all different walks of life and for different reasons, and how that can radicalize us in both, one, in our direction of being a communist, and two, in the direction of being an anti-communist, which, maybe we can touch on that. But anyway, so today I have Mr. Poke Preet here. I'm very excited to have you back on to the podcast. I thought the last time you came on was really great. You have anything you want to say real quick?
Good to be back.
Cool. And then we have our near and dear Ms. Nebula here, longtime supporter on our Discord, always helping us out with different tasks and, moral support, our meetings and all that kind of stuff. And I figured it'd be good to have you on here too, since given your background and the input and the things that you have to say. So I'm pretty excited for that. And then, of course, we have Aria. So
hello.
Hi, everyone. So we got Cutie in the chat saying hello, muffins. We got Wumbo, hello, Cutie. Oh, you're not even saying hello to us. You're saying hello to Cutie.
Rude.
Okay.
Is Cutie hopping on, or?
No, Cutie's not hopping on.
Cutie's in the shadows.
Yeah, Cutie's white. He's not first gen. So he's banned from this podcast in particular.
For sure.
Yeah. So anyway, so I think I'll just, sort of start us off here with sort of like my perspective on all this things. So I've talked about some of this stuff already on the podcast before, but I'll just kind of reiterate, for posterity or whatever. So basically, so I was, as a first gen, I was born in the States. And my parents, and also for our guests, you can be as personal or unpersonal as you want. I don't mind, being a little bit more personal about, my story. So I was born in Connecticut, and my parents were refugees from Guatemala. So they came up in the late 80s. And for those who don't know, basically at the time, Guatemala was thrust into a 30-year-long civil war. It all began when Guatemala had elected its first democratic president, Jacobo Arbenz. And Arbenz at the time was doing land reform in order to give land to the peasantry, and that land was being taken from United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita Banana, who owned about 40% of the entire country. They owned the railroads, the telephone lines, the telegraph lines, the ports, plantations, everything. They owned everything. So the peasantry were working for, pennies on the dollar, So basically what happened was Dwight Eisenhower and the board at Chiquita Banana were basically like, this guy's a communist. He's taking our land. He's taking our resources. He wasn't a communist. He was a liberal. And so we got to put an end to this. So they found a bunch of rebels, right wingers and such, gave them a bunch of guns, gave them planes and stuff. And they basically were told, go run around and just, fuck everything up. So that's what they did. They started running around, killing people, shooting people, and eventually, led to Jacobo stepping down And when he stepped down, a new person came in, Castillo Armas, and he basically, military junta, dictatorship, the whole 9 yards. And basically, it caused this vacuum to occur. What followed after this was, as the United States was preparing to invade Cuba, what became known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA was building an airport in Guatemala in the jungle that they would launch the invasion from. So it's my understanding that a bunch of junior military officers had basically discovered that this was, being built, and they decided that they did not want to be more so of a puppet to the United States. So they stormed the presidential palace. They killed a bunch of people. They couped the guy who couped the first guy, and it basically cascaded into a bunch of different factions fighting for power. Some right-wing factions, some moderate factions, some communist factions. It got to the point where eventually the United States started flying B-52 bombers in Guatemala and just bombing the countryside in order to kill as many rebels and people as possible. At the same time, while this was occurring, the right-wing death squads were attacking indigenous populations, indigenous Mayan populations. So there was an event that occurred during this war called the Silent Holocaust, because they killed a minimum of 150,000 indigenous people. It is more than likely more than that. And basically the international community, everybody, much like today, didn't do anything about it. They didn't care. It was not their struggle, it was not their fight. So basically what happened is my parents were like, all right, so we got to leave. We got to get out of here. So they came here when they were teenagers. They came here separately. They met each other when they were already in the States. My parents, they, like a lot of people, they have to basically do what they have to do in order to get, access to the country. Some people hire, smugglers called coyotes. Some people hop trains. Some people, they get a visa and then they just don't go back. Some people are lucky to get asylum or to get, get basically a citizenship almost immediately. But that's more for people who have money. So basically, my parents get to this country, and what happens is they basically try to live the American dream, right? So they fall in love or whatever, and they decide that they're gonna have a bunch of babies. They have me, and my brothers, and basically it becomes super apparent that the American dream is a bunch of bullshit. They begin to struggle financially, essentially immediately. They struggle to maintain a household, as they were, banks were selling houses to people super cheap in the early 2000s with ridiculous interest rates and whatever. So, me and my parents, they basically were basically struggling to, to live. Eventually this stress leads to a sort of schism where basically my parents realized that they can't reconcile their relationship. They split. There's all this conflict about money. Me and my brothers are now sort of even more so in poverty, right? So what started to happen to me in this regards is that the way I grew up in this country, and maybe you guys can relate to this, is they made it super explicitly clear when I was young that I was different, that I did not fit in here, particularly because I grew up in a town of white people in southern New York. So they always told me you have to know where your green card, you have to know where your IDs are, your birth certificate. You gotta, you always have to remember you're a citizen. Don't let people, basically, frisk you or whatever, that kind of stuff. And I realized how much of what was being told to me, particularly by my father, was based off his own trauma. So my father, for example, he used to tell me all the time that I should never hang out with a group of more than 3 boys at a time. And I never really understood why until I got older. And as he would tell me stories about, Guatemala during the Civil War, he would tell me about how the army would chase groups of boys and either arrest them or straight up kill them, or capture them, torture them, or whatever. So in his head, even though I was like 6, he still had like this mentality, this anxiety of like, don't talk to the cops, don't be near them, don't be in association with people who are up to no good, who might be perceived as up to no good, because he was younger when the war was more at its peak, so he wasn't really like involved this way, but he would tell me stories about how his brothers would be chased through the wilderness in order to basically capture his brothers, either to torture them or conscript them or whatever. So he still had sort of like this mentality that he brought to this country. So I have a distinct memory of when I was in the 3rd grade. We used to read Kids Time magazine, and there was a whole article about like people immigrating and jumping over the border and whatever. And I remember like saying to my classroom, like, because I could tell at the time that the article was, even though it was for kids, was sort of swayed to say that these people were bad people. So I remember saying to my classroom, like, hey, like my dad has his green card, so you guys can't do anything about it. I remember particularly saying you guys can't do anything about it. And I remember my teacher kind of laughed. I don't know if like she thought it was funny or it was like a nervous laugh or what, but like very early on, like it was drilled in my head that you are different, your parents are different, you're from a different place. You are lucky because you're a citizen, but your parents are not. So like that really, stuck with me. So like politically wise, I had an understanding that that basically that sorry, 1 second. I sort of like I knew that the United States had fucked up Guatemala. I had a very rudimentary sense of like anti-imperialism, but I wasn't a communist at all. I was sort of under the belief that I felt that America had changed. America doesn't do that kind of stuff anymore, which is funny because even at the time when we were invading Iraq and invading Afghanistan, like I still had this like hope that like, well, it's got to be for like a good reason, you know what I mean? But it wasn't until the college days and stuff that I really started to be radicalized. And I think for me, like sort of like the precipice of moving away from liberalism to communism was when the ICE concentration camps were built, and I started to have a much deeper understanding that like we as Hispanic people are hated. We're hated. We're second class. We're seen as a labor force, a reserve army of labor. We're used as a scapegoat against for the working class to blame their problems on. And, to this day, I experience extremely casual racism, especially in the medical field. When I would work for like nonprofits who, again, the emphasis is nonprofit, and we would take charity cases of like people who didn't have papers or whatever. And like staff just very casually being like, oh, he's an illegal or whatever. And it's like, dog, why is this part of the conversation? Like, they're just a person. Like, I don't, their worth is not intrinsic to whether or not they have papers or not. They're just human beings. But yeah, I think that's kind of like a really a quick sort of rundown of my experience. I think so. We'll kind of do that and then kind of comment on each other's stories and add things as we go along. So Poke Preet, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I'll say first of all, I think what first generation people can contribute to sort of like the left movement or communist movement within America is just bringing a perspective from a society that is sort of already mask off, right? Like America, when you're trying to build like a left movement in a society, I hate to say the word, but like authoritarian. But like it would be more mask off because like whatever limited civil liberties are given in America are obviously just like farces for like political reasons. If you want to add on to that, Ivan.
Yeah, for sure. Like the way the sort of liberal structure of society is built is you have to give enough how do you call it? You have to give enough uh concessions, there we go, for
Yeah.
people to make them feel as if they are sort of like above the crop. And you see that a lot in Hispanic communities where, again, it was a very stark contrast where we have straight up concentration camps, but then you have a class of Hispanic people who are in the petit bourgeois, who make money, who
Mhm.
are Republicans, who are using that privilege of like being able to vote or, you know, buy a house and, you know, be considered a citizen, but only because of what they contribute to society. And I don't mean contribute in the sense of like being a laborer, as in like because they're like stockbrokers or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that big imperial core dweller divide and global south dweller divide, I think Gen 1 people are sort of like able to bridge that because, you know, I have family members that have tried to build a communist party in India, for example, worked within the communist movement there. And like when you're in a society that can't afford to give you enough material concessions to give you civil liberties, right? Because in the global south, obviously, you're more limited in the material concessions you can give to gain consent from your population. So you have to be very openly authoritarian. Anarchism goes right out the window. Like all of these you very quickly learn that Marxist Leninism, which was, you know, developed under czarist autocracy, constant destruction of the presses, constant arresting of Communist Party members, is like the superior form of organization within the colonial context. And I think within America that gets lost. I think what Gen 1 people are able to do is give a perspective that is from the global south while also having all of the organizational benefits of being within the beast, you know, the imperial
Yeah,
core.
yeah. So I actually wanted to make a TikTok about this for a while, but I've brought this up to both Nebula and Aria before. I think particularly in us being in the Imperial Core, why do we see more black and brown people advocating for Marxist Leninism vanguard? Is because we have seen from our parents, or not even first gen, people who are directly from these other countries, have seen what it is like to not have political power and what that truly means to not have any civil liberties, to not to be simply a worm to the bourgeois.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
when we are talking about revolution, when we're talking about taking power, we are talking about taking by force the ability to wield and use political power 100% in our favor. And that's where, you know, this sort of argument comes where people talk about, well, that's authoritarianism. Yes, yes, we are talking about becoming the authority because we know what it's like to not have any authority. So in the
Exactly. Yeah.
States, you get a lot of people, particularly white anarchists, who have this idea that because they already have political power intrinsic to their person, that there's no need to build because they already benefit off of the system that is here, while we don't.
It's like the left version of being a hippie. Like, oh, we should just all get along.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
aren't we all one? Like that kind of.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And
Things
they
like
don't
that.
realize it because I think, as someone who at one point did not consider myself a communist and was on a more anarchist kind of path, I didn't necessarily link all those things up. It was when I started reading theory that those things started connect, and I was like,
Yeah.
oh, this makes so much more sense to me, even in the way that I just naturally think, which is
Right,
why I'm
right.
always harping on that. It's from experience. But yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, Ivan. I think that people who live and breathe power and ooze it out of every ore and a pore and never have to really try to grasp at it in any way and are
Mm-hmm.
not subjected to any type of judgment, oppression, you know, the
Right, right,
gamut
right.
of those things. Like, they don't have to think about it, so they don't have to think about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, so many like people on the American left, I think, are like, oh, well, they're afraid, right? They're afraid of exercising any kind of power. They're like, what if we become the twin evil of the power that we're trying to extinguish. And it's like, you have never experienced the other side of the American gun, or like
Right.
the Western world client states gun. And when you do, and first generation people experience that just through their family stories, things like that. Like, we're very close to that. You realize the superiority of, just a disciplined vanguard party, dictatorship, proletariat, things like that. Going into like my personal family story, my family was always sympathetic to communism. They were involved heavily within the Maoist movement in India, the Naxalites, but they were in sort of like a local organization within the Punjab. So the Punjab is a state in India that's close to Pakistan, and we're a little bit culturally distinct. We're probably like the most recognizable sort of sub-minority within India. I think that's controversial to say for other Indians. The comment section are going to be fun, but my family immigrated in the 90s. It was following the 80s. In the 80s, there was a genocide against Punjabis and Sikhs. The context around the genocide is a bit complicated. It was done because of the Khalistan movement, which was a separatist Sikh movement that was religious fundamentalist, very like right wing. And in reaction to that, people just started mass lynching Punjabis. And I don't act like the motivations of the Khalistan movement weren't legitimate. There are many issues within the Punjab, of course, the Punjab region, but the Khalistan people themselves, I don't agree with their methods or their conclusion of a separatist Punjab. So there was a genocide. My family personally had experiences with very close calls. The genocide was done by the Indian state itself. It was repression. They were very afraid of the Punjab separating from India. And so like there's crazy stories about like my uncle having to change his walking route home from school because there was a policeman and he would just grab like random kids walking home from school and they would be found dead like weeks later after he grabbed them or things like that. A couple of family friends were found dead just randomly after being picked up by police, just crazy stories like that. So my grandpa got a green card within Mexico, and he paid a couple coyotes to hop the fence, and he worked as a fruit picker for a couple years. And he loves the agriculture industry. My family were peasant farmers in the Punjab, so we've been farming for thousands of years. They live and breathe farming. They love that kind of stuff, that agricultural work. And so he was absolutely happy being a fruit picker, even if it is a brutal job. In the 80s or 90s, 80s, late 80s, early 90s, Reagan passed a bill that allowed some migrant farm workers to become legalized if they had been working for about 3 years, I believe. And so that's how my grandpa got his green card. And then you sort of get the chain migration from there. My father himself also separately came to America, and same thing, got a green card within Mexico, tried to hop the fence. He got caught and he was within prison for like about a year. And so I think all these stories sort of just shaped me, learning about my family's organization efforts within India, just the violence of immigrating itself to America, like my father being held in jail for a year. He lost his eyesight. He lost a good bit of his eyesight because, there was no light in that room except for like an artificial light. And, it's just sort of radicalizes you, just going from just this firsthand experience with the third world, the other end of the American gun.
For sure. I wanted to comment real quick when you were talking about the cop just grabbing kids off the street. It reminded me of a story my father told me that when he was a child, these planes would fly by and drop off leaflets, all kinds of stuff. And there was one, it was for some person, I don't know if they were running for president or what. My father is a child, he doesn't know how to read. So he starts picking up these posters and he starts just like nailing them to like posts and stuff. He's a kid, he's just messing around. And my grandfather discovered my father doing that and he beat him because, as my grandfather explained to him, if you do stuff like this, we become a target and people are going to come here and see that we support somebody and they're going to come and they're going to wipe us out. And so that used to happen too in Guatemala, where like entire families would just be slaughtered overnight. A lot of times it seems like what my father used to tell me is no one really knew if it was the sort of the general term for rebel in Guatemala was the guerrillas or the army, but now we understand it was the army, usually going around in plain clothes and just killing people. And my father told me a story once where he was walking to the store or something, and he saw his first dead person, just a person just in the street, just pew pewed, and he was like, really, scrambled eggs about that. But I don't want to harp too much on that. Do you have any more on your story, or you want to pass it to maybe Nebula?
I'll just say, yeah. I mean, I'll just say pretty much, my family carried a lot of the trauma from colonialism, just the immigration process, things like that. Though usually, like my dad, like whenever he would tell like a really traumatizing story, he'd laugh a little, like he'd play it off like a joke. I don't know if that's common among
Mm-hmm.
immigrant fathers, but like they'll tell you the most traumatizing shit, and then
That's
they'll say it like
common.
a joke with a laugh. Yeah, and you'll just be like, "Are you okay?"
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'll pass it off to Nebula. That's all I really have to say.
Yeah, I think my humor kind of stems from that too. Like sometimes something messed up would happen and I give like a little chuckle of like, you know, this is kind of messed up, but I'm gonna laugh about it a little bit anyways to ease the tension. But yeah, my name is Nebula. I'm actually a first gen Salvadorian immigrant here. My mom left El Salvador in because of the Salvadorian Civil War. She was studying to be a nurse there, and she kind of helped the rebels kind of fight against the Salvadorian government, which was very authoritarian back then. I mean, like you would vote for. It was at a point where a majority of the people would vote for not the government, so like a political candidate that would be stating that they were opposing the type of government that they were in there. And then somehow 100% of the vote would go to the Salvadorian candidate that would be a part of the government. So it was very, rigged. They could tell that that was happening. They were getting upset about it. And it led to a revolution that lasted 10 years. During those 10 years, a lot of my family migrated from El Salvador to the US. All of them were taken by coyotes from like crossing the border to the US. And the only person that actually came here legally to the US was my grandmother. I don't think you can imagine a 75-year-old trying to hop a border, she's the only one that came here legally. But I don't know, like I remember stories from my mother, her telling me how she would just see like her friends unalived on the ground, how some kids would run when they would be, because I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the Salvadorian government actually had a lot of child soldiers. I don't know if I could say that on here, but they had a lot of child soldiers. My uncles were included in that as well. I have actually an uncle here in the US that was a child soldier by choice for the government. I would say he was brainwashed. All that propaganda was getting to his head. And he's actually a conservative now here in the US as well. So it's very interesting to hear his perspective on things from the past. How he would say that the rebels were ruining El Salvador, how it was a perfect country. And then you have my mom that was on the opposite side that would talk about how, El Salvador was in a horrible state and that elections were rigged and just how horrible our conditions were back then. We live in a small village. It's exactly how you would picture a third world country looking like. Huts. We have no real access to water, things like that. And so it was just interesting growing up. And I do want to mention one thing. I don't know if you guys know that there's a Salvadorian documentary out there. It's actually called Voces Inocentes, which is Innocent Voices. That documentary perfectly depicts the Salvadorian struggle back then during the Salvadorian Civil War. I highly recommend you guys watch it. It shows the struggle between you know, both sides of the war and just this kid trying to survive. A lot of kids back then would just be taken during school. The government would show up, give a list of names of kids that were 12 years and older. And if you were on that list, you would end up being a soldier for the government. That's just how it was. So when my mom turned 19, she left the El Salvador, came here, and she applied for what's it called again?
Green card?
No, the asylum
Oh.
card. Yeah, for asylum. And she was one of the very few that got picked from my family here to come for asylum. She's worked out in factory ever since then. And I guess you could say she had the American dream kind of realized in a sense, in the fact that you know, we grew up with food on our on our table. I had a roof over my head. People weren't aiming guns at me or pew pews at me. You know, I wasn't living the life that she had in El Salvador, so she thought that I was living the American dream. Um, Only recently did she start realizing that the American dream is not what it truly is. Um, she's struggling to pay rent. She's struggling to put food on the table now. She's realizing that things are turning out to be exactly like how they were in El Salvador. She's noticing that pattern, and she literally told me a year and a half ago around there. She said, "You know what? Like, I ran from El Salvador, but I honestly should have kept running." She told me that she shouldn't have stopped in the US. She should have gone somewhere else, somewhere more socialist, I guess you could say, in her mind. Um, she didn't like the fact that she stopped in the first place that would grant her, I guess you could say, asylum. And she kind of regrets it now because we know now, being in the core, that it's not all of what it's said to be when you're living in another country. I think that's what attracts so many immigrants to this nation, is the talk that this is the greatest country in the world, which is, it's not a good it's not a good thing to chat about in different countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember when I would be walking around the village and I'm with one of my cousins, and I remember a bunch of school children like straight up surrounded me like a paparazzi, and they were so excited that I was from New York of all places, and they were asking me so many questions about New York City. And like, it's just kind of remarkable now that like walking away with that kind of like dichotomy, that like all these people see that I'm different, and people in America also see that I'm different. But I'm telling you that America is not all that it's cracked up to be. And for, you know, the naysayers who say things like, "Oh, well, they're not pointing guns at you yet, and they're not taking your civil liberties yet," you haven't been paying attention then, because they've been doing it. They've been doing it this entire time. It's just the United States has a much bigger apparatus, a much bigger propaganda machine in order to spin things in a way that makes you not see those things. You know, during the George Floyd uprisings, the biggest rebellion that has happened in the States in decades, you know, they killed people 100%. And I've mentioned this before on the podcast, where like when events like that happen, they're so poorly like recorded and documented that like when you see like, oh, people are missing or whatever, they're dead. They were killed by the police or the military or kidnapped or whatever, and they're just gone. Like this machine has a much bigger capacity to make people just straight up disappear, you know.
I mean, they didn't really hide a lot of those murders of the Black Lives Matter activists.
Those
They
in
kind of did them
particular,
openly, I will say. Yeah.
Yeah. I meant more of like not that those didn't happen on the streets, but like the straight up brawls with the National Guard and the federal police and all that, putting people in vans and stuff. They were just killing people, shooting at people, you know, like it's always funny to me when they talk about, they shot them with rubber bullets and then, someone got shot for real. It's like, dog, I think they're just shooting at you with bullets. like let's be real. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. But thank you for sharing that, Nebula. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. One thing I'll add really quick is when Nebula said people are living in like huts and things like that. I think that's what's so important about the first generation perspective, because like whenever we read about like, oh, Stalin gave people healthcare, like gave them a railroad, like it's a like it doesn't seem that impressive to people within the first world. But when you actually live in that like peasant context without like clean water and like in huts, like you said, like when you live that peasant experience, it's so fucking amazing just to get a little bit of a human dignity. Like even your kids having an education or something like that.
Yep.
I remember I was reading Anna Louise Strong, and they built a railroad near a small Kazakh village, and the villagers fucking started dancing, right? Like the railroad just came by them. And it's so hard for us as Americans to understand that in this like highly developed, highly industrialized, like even some people call it like a post-industrialized society. But for people who are living in like basically like medieval times, like a lot of people still do, Latin America, Africa, Asia, Middle East, obviously more so nowadays thanks to neoliberalism than before, but it's these just basic human rights are amazing.
Yeah, like
I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, like my family actually had like a 3-hour long conversation like about a year ago because we got paved roads. They were all excited because we got paved roads in our village. So that was like the talk of like for like a whole year as they were paving it, people were excited. They were like, our cars they're not going to get all dirty anymore. Like it's just simple things like that that just cause like a huge difference that I feel like people in America take for granted, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And one, sorry, but one super thing I'll add really quick. I'm sorry, I'm cutting Aria off before she gives her thing. But America has been really good. We've been talking about like how like immigrants love America and like people in the third world love America. America has been so good at creating like a cultural super hegemony just globally to make its like colonialism and like neocolonialism so much easier, where it's like sort of manufactured consent for people all over the globe by projecting an American image of like America as this like pseudo utopia and like this like amazing society that is like actually your country's friend. And that's made it so much more easier for like American capital just like penetrate third world countries and gain consent from their populations to exploit them easier. And I think that's just something that America has been really good at that we have to fight culturally. And then I'll just pass it off to other people.
All right, Aria. Your turn.
So, first of all, I just want to say that I appreciate all of your stories. My story is a little bit different. I did not come from a place that has the kind of historical oppression that you all have dealt with in your family's lineage. My parents are from the Azores Islands, which is an autonomous region of Portugal. A lot of people don't know where it is because it's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's a lot of what you said, Preet, ties into what I was going to talk about, because my parents, I was born in 82 for context, and my parents were born in 43 and 47. So it's a long time ago, but, they grew up in extreme poverty. My mom had like 10 brothers and sisters, and they slept on like essentially piles of hay with like a sack on it. And so that experience kind of propelled them into a mindset when they came to the US. They came initially, I believe, to visit family because my mom had an aunt out here. And then they went back, and I don't think they intended to come back. But when my older brother was born in the Azores, he couldn't breathe. Like when he was first born, and that was very traumatic. So I think they thought, because of all the US propaganda, oh, their medical must be a lot better. Their industry is more set up for that. And that's one of the reasons they came out to the US. But I grew up with parents that kind of, it was like a weird division, because in a way, my parents had some class consciousness, because my dad would talk to me about things that are classism, but not understand that they were classism. And my dad was in the union growing up, and he really talked a lot about how important it was to be in the workers' union at that time. So I grew up with that. but at the same time, they were very much, and to a degree still are, like, bootstrapped all the way into the propaganda and the idea that, like, if they just work hard enough, you know, they definitely had some petty bourgeois aspirations. And I have spoken to many people who are first generation Americans who have talked to me about the same kind of thing. So I don't know if that's something that any of you can relate to in your families, but you know, the trying to start your own business. And I really think the reason they were trying to start their own businesses is because when they were working for other people, they were dealing with xenophobia and you know, different types of prejudice and classism, and they didn't really know what to do there. So they're like, well, we'll start our own thing, you know? And I think that's another part of it, that it kind of tricks people. Like, it's like you have the propaganda of, yeah, let's live the American dream, which we all know is a lie. But also, like, if you don't want to tolerate being treated like absolute crap by people, especially in the time that they came to the US, you're going to just try to start your own thing. In fact, my brother-in-law is Cambodian and Chinese, and he's spoken to me about the same thing because his parents also had a business. So they bought into that. They bought into the idea that if they just work hard enough, things will be okay.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about how, in a way, my radicalization began probably from talking to people that were other first generation Americans, because that's always been something that I found commonality with people in, because the Azores is so small that I moved around a lot. So I got just told that it didn't exist. So, like, I didn't really have ways to relate to people culturally in that specific way. And so the way that I would relate to people was through the, like, first generation experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That makes sense. And you know, the business, sort of starting your own business thing, is we see it happening in the States all the time too, where it's the opposite thinking of like trying to build a, you know, a socialist society, where it's like, you know, I've been stepped on, my whole family's been stepped on. Now if I can step on somebody, then
Yeah.
I'll be okay and my family will be okay. And it might not be that like aggressive kind of like thought process, but that's where
Yeah.
it's coming from, you know, because
Yeah.
inevitably petite bourgeois aspirations, which lead to, you know, capitalism, it breeds the same thing, breeds the same conditions that they tried to escape from.
I think it's both naive and aggressive, in the sense that, like, you know, if I think about conversations my dad had or things that he would talk about when I was younger, it was both the naivete of thinking that that's what you just do, like that is how you make, you know, provide for your family and stuff, and that's, you know, it ties into masculinity in that sense too, and machismo, but also the idea of, like, an American man, because, you know, depending on your culture, that's, as a man, you're taught that you need to provide, and, like, the image of the American man and the propaganda behind that was something my dad fully bought into, like, to the extent that he would think that he needed things that he didn't need just to do his work, because he bought in. He wanted to assimilate. He wanted to be like everybody else. And my father had a very heavy accent, and my father is definitely darker than I am and does not look like he's from this country. And he dealt with it probably the worst out of all of us, because my mom definitely looks more like European.
Yeah.
And so having the accent as well, like, I think he just wanted to kind of, like, disappear, you know, into whatever form of whiteness he could assimilate into.
Yeah, exactly. It's a simulation. And I'm really glad you said that, because that's something I wanted to bring up with you guys. Unless you have something else you want to say in particular about your
No,
story.
just I think that the reason these stories are important to me personally is because viewing these things, being in the US, whether, you know, you're born here or you move right before, you know, right when you're young, like, you do see and you know what the experience is to be othered on different levels. And you also know what the experience is to have to do two things all the time. Like, one, be one thing at home and be one thing outside. And a lot of times you're also having to take on a certain role of adulthood at a very early age, because your parents they depend on you to help them assimilate. And that's a lot. And I think it sets your brain up in a kind of way where once class consciousness hits you, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
All these things that I went through make sense.
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts, and then I'll lead into my next question for everybody. So, yeah, for sure. It's like living a double life. And I felt like I've really been sort of doing that my entire life, even as a communist, like having this online personality, having this name, doing this organization, and then I got to go to work and be a different person.
Yeah.
And not talk about the things that I want to talk about or be the way that I want to be. And for some people, particularly white people, it's very easy for them to be like, oh, well, I just say what I got to say wherever. And it's like, well, this is my job and my livelihood. And sometimes I just got to grit my teeth and deal with casual racism or whatever because I need a job. And y'all don't understand what it's like to, not you guys, but like them don't understand what it's like to be put out of work and, having to survive, But yeah, I was something that stuck out to me when you were talking. I think I kind of just made a connection here where I, particularly at work, as a nurse, whenever we get new people, whether they're a new nurse or a new CNA or a new tech, I like to go out of my way to show them how to do, even if they're not particularly doing that particular task. I will be like, come with me. We're gonna go. I want to show you how to do something. And I did that earlier today, and I like it. I enjoy it, and it's also for me to get to know somebody if they're gonna handle the medical field and whatever. You see all kinds of different stuff, right? But I think I just put the connection together live HD 4K that the reason why I do that is because growing up, as we started to get more Guatemalan or Hispanic or Salvadorian kids who only spoke Spanish, they would pair them with me so I could show them like the ropes, basically. So I could speak to them in Spanish and help them with their homework and their assignments, show them where the bathroom is, show them how to do things, show them how to act. Like the responsibility was taken away from administration, from teachers, and was placed on me and placed on kids like me. And again, maybe that was done intentionally. Maybe it was well intended because they were like, well, they're similar, they can help each other out. But regardless, like I kind of think I just realized that that's why I've always liked to show people how to do stuff and teach people things, because that was just something that was sort of put onto me at such a early age. That's crazy. But yeah, so I want to talk about assimilating and sort of living that double life, right? Because like I don't know if you guys can relate to this, but something that sticks out to me, like we talk about the culture around food, right? Like cultural food versus American food. And like I remember like thinking about like, at home, what would be, for dinner, tortillas and eggs, or chicharron, or frijoles, or caldo, whatever, tamales, just like very cultural, traditional, very simple, rich food. And, as a child, and certified fatty, like what I used to, fuck that up, it was good stuff. But like, as I got older, and so like 6, 7, 10 years old, like, and starting to see that my friends, white friends, eating burgers, fries, pizza, pasta, like very American stuff, when you would bring your food to school, you would start to notice that like, oh, I'm different, my food smells different, things are different. And kids who just say whatever comes to their mind would be like, hey, what's that? That's weird. It smells weird. It looks weird. It's not what I like. It's not what me and all my homies here are eating. We're eating lean cuisine and Lunchables. You're eating beans. That's weird. And it's so funny how jealous I used to be of kids who would eat like Lunchables and those fucking
Or McDonald's.
ham and crackers
Yes.
at McDonald's. And I would be like, I don't want to eat beans anymore, because you wanted to be like your peers.
That is assimilation. And I think you just made me think of something, Ivan. We kind of talked about this before, but like you can't even really complain to your parents about it, because they basically tell you that, like, you're an American. What do you mean they pick on you? Like,
Did I lose Aria's audio or?
I don't know. Maybe.
Nope.
I can
you
hear
not
it.
hear me? Okay. Well, maybe. Anyway, like my parents would use the bootstrap kind of argument a lot, which is like, you're an American citizen kind of thing. And I feel like that also is part of this idea that, like, essentially your suffering is invisible, because you're both taught that, like, you need to assimilate, but also, like, when you try to like, as a kid, you kind of take that on. You're like, sure, for the most part. And then you're like, well, I'm being treated differently, and you can't talk to your parents about it because they don't understand, because they fully bought in. That's the reason they're here in most cases, is because they fully bought in. So if they have invested in this to such a degree, it's an emotional investment. I mean, for my parents, they believed that they were coming here to give me a better life. So if you believe that, and then you have your child being like, but it's not a better life, even in some small way, you're going to have to be in denial of that to continue doing what you're doing. So I don't know.
Right.
It's like a small thing, but it's just an
Yeah.
example of the ways that parents kind of can buy into that and, like, perpetuate that. And also, I think in probably all of our cases, when we've reflected on that, gone like, oh yeah, that's just some bootstrapping shit.
So, when it comes to assimilation, and I guess sort of the question I have for you guys is, was there ever like a particular moment that stands out to you that, like, it really kind of hits you that you're like, oh, I don't belong here? So for me, it was, so when I was in high school, a lot more refugees were started coming to school, and I went to a big high school. So a lot of Guatemalans, Central Americans, Mexicans, and they were all the same age. And basically there were so many of them that my school, they did honestly a really impressive thing, I would say, for the time. They took a whole wing of the school and they made it English as a second language wing. And they put all these kids in New York curriculum. They hired all these teachers to teach them New York curriculum in Spanish so they could get their high school diploma. I think that was an amazing idea. But so now there's a whole part of the school that's just these kids, right, who just speak Spanish. So I remember, like, hearing who I thought were my friends repeating things that their parents were saying about how, you know, there's so many slurs here. There's so many of these kids here. They don't speak our language. They're taking our resources. And we're like 13 years old. And I remember, like, one of my friends, like, walking up to me and basically being like, can't you believe all these, you know, slurs? And, like, I am them. I look like them. And it, like, really hit me in that moment that, like, there's no difference between me being born in Connecticut and these kids being born in Guatemala. We're the same age. We're peers. The only difference was I was born on this side of the wall and they were born on that side of the wall. And somehow that elevates me in the position of these white people because I speak well, which is always a compliment I got when I was young. But you had to learn how to speak well in order to get by, because just by default, the way that you look puts you at a disadvantage. So you have to learn to have a good vocabulary and a good vernacular in order to, you know, get through the day. So that, for me, in that moment at the bus stop, was like that crystallizing moment that, like, these people do not accept me. They accept me for the perspective they think that I am at, not for who I actually am. So I know Nebula said that she had a moment like that. You want to talk about that?
Oh yeah, I definitely had a moment like that. It was also in high school, coincidentally. But it was when we were filling out our paperwork for university, like our college admissions, university admissions, applications, things like that. We were finally given, you know, that paperwork that you have where you fill out your name, your date of birth, your social security, things like that. And then comes the key question: what is your race and what is your ethnicity? And I look at this paper mad confused. I am looking at this paper and I'm like, I don't know what I am. I don't know, like, all I know is that I'm Latina. That's all I know.
Right.
So I asked my teacher that's supposed to know way more than I do, a full-blown adult. what do I fill out in this paper? And I ask her, and I'm also looking at my classmates, by the way, because we're all really confused as to what we fill out. It's a classroom full of Hispanic and Latino kids, and we're all confused as to what to write. And she tells the whole classroom, just fill in white. You're white. You're all white. And I swear I had maybe like half of those classmates be like, so like they're not even close to my skin color. Like not even close to my skin color. They're so much more darker than I am. And they're so confused. And they're like, what do you mean I'm putting in white? And the teacher just goes casually, just put white. That's all that you are. Like that's what you are here. And that left me shocked, to say the least. Like I'm never gonna like it, just because we're labeled as white so that we could be assimilated into this country, so that we don't have our own identity, so that we don't have something that like we can call our own. And I realized that from that very moment, that whatever I call my own is never going to really be my own. Like I'm never going to be who I want to be in the US, because it doesn't benefit the US unless I fill in white. Then that's when I start benefiting this country. So that really changed my perspective on everything that I went through and I keep going through. It's just a hellscape that we can't escape, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, I think the first moment was I used to have like a really heavy Indian accent. Like I used to get made fun for it. And of course the food, the stinky food, I would like ask my mom not to pack me Indian food and things like that. And so for a little while I was like calling myself American. You know, like I would call myself American. And you know, I think what's also hard is like when you're like a sub ethnicity like Punjabi, like Americans have like a hard time understanding that. Like I'm sure everybody here, like in most Americans' minds, are just like Mexican, right? Like basically, you know, like Portuguese, Guatemalan. You know, like I'm sorry, but as far as most Americans are concerned, this is just a Mexican and an Indian. But like I
That's
think
100% true in my experience.
yeah, so I think just like sort of navigating that American ignorance to like those sub ethnicities is sort of just like such a tough thing to do, especially when you're trying to figure out your own identity, especially how you fit within like the American racial framework. That's all I'll add.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think in a way I became aware of it early on just because where my parents happened to be from, you know, people barely know about it now, but if you think about 1982 when the internet didn't exist, that's when I was born. So I started school in 87. So like, you know, I was aware that I was from a place where people were either like, where's that? Or that doesn't exist. And my parents moved around a lot. So there were times that I was around other kids that were Azorian, but I didn't relate to them because a lot of times they had parents that were in a higher sort of class level. And so I feel like assimilated more maybe because they had been in the same place. You know, there's a lot of factors for that. Whereas my parents, I've probably moved like 20 times growing up. And my dad was not in the US military, to answer that question, which most people ask. So like I was pretty aware of it young, but I remember in high school, and this ties into like a kind of facet I don't think we've talked about yet. I was in summer school. I was in a pretty deep depression. I was like 15. And you know, I think a lot of it had to do with my identity in different ways. But I was sitting next to this super Aryan looking lady, young lady. And I was looking, her arm was like next to mine because she was sitting in the desk next to mine. And I remember seeing her skin was really light and she had no hair on her arms. And then I was like looking at my arm and looking at hers and I felt so dirty. And that was like, I mean, it hits me to talk about, but
it hit me.
I think that that's something that POC deal with, that like from a young age, you're taught that you're essentially like something that is impure or whatever.
Yeah, 100%. I think this is also a good transition. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was like mental health and like family dynamics and how being, here as first gen and how it's affected our mental health and all that. Like, when you said that, like it hits because I felt very similar to that as well. Like I remember, like, I'm gonna get vulnerable here for a second, but like I remember when I was, being betrayed by my friends, saying all these crazy things to me about people who looked and act and talked like me, that I wanted to cut off my skin. Like genuine violent thoughts as a teenager, because like I knew that I was different and I wasn't being accepted unless, like in Nebula's case, if I became white, because that was the moment where, I could have made that decision where I could have also been like, yeah, you know what? Fuck these kids and I'll be part of you guys, be accepted. I'll be one of the good ones,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that want to sort of assimilate, especially with like Eurocentric beauty standards and sort of like just a lot of things drilled into us is a very deep thing in a lot of people. Obviously, I felt like that before. One thing I will say is I do work with kids, and Gen Alpha seems to be a lot more accepting. I will say, like obviously they'll still say something stupid. My kids will say something stupid, like a joke towards like the black kid or something like that. But overall, the white kids, the Hispanic kids, the black kids, they seem to be a lot more just. This new generation seems to be so much more understanding of each other and the cultural diversities and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and I think, part of it is having access, to the internet and being able to see like a variety of people and being able to have access to understand elements of capitalism from a young age. But also, we all have to do our part to encourage that type of thinking and questioning of the system that we're in. There was something that I was going to say, but I lost my thought. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have anything you want to say, Neb? Or
No, I just wanted to say like I know it comes from, like, we're not a monolith, right? So I know we all have our different experiences. Me growing up personally, I grew up in a predominantly Latino neighborhood. So, my classmates would speak Spanish. I don't really relate to the whole like Lunchables thing because everyone in my class hated Lunchables. We preferred pupusas, pozole, things like that. So when it came to like my emotion, like my health, like my mental health, it mostly stemmed from my family. It mostly stemmed from my mother, especially because of the color of my skin. I'm very pale, as you can tell. So my mother, and to this day, she still does this, but she likes the fact that I am light skinned. She does not like it when I tan. She does not like it when I wear things that, dye my hair red because it makes me look darker. She doesn't like when things like that happen, like I do those things, because then it makes me lose my privilege that I have, that she knows that I would have as a light skinned person. She thinks that white is pristine. She thinks that whiteness is what we should all aim for. And it's very sad to see because I know that I am light skinned, but I am also a brown person, like I'm not a white person. And she's trying to assimilate me into someone that I am not. So it didn't come from the outside, I guess you could say. It came from the inside. It came from the person that was supposed to raise me and tell me that you are beautiful, you are unique, you are yourself. And it turned into why aren't you white enough? Why can't you speak English well enough? Why can't you do this? Like it reminds me of I'm pretty sure all of us can relate to this, but growing up I had to translate everything. And a big phrase that my mother would say was, why don't you know this? You're going to school for a reason. Like, why can't you translate this, dog? And I'm like, dog, I'm trying so hard right now, but I cannot say hepatitis at 7, you know? Like, I just
Right.
can't do that. So it shaped me in various ways, some ways bad, some ways good. But you know, I'm also the first person in my family to have gone to therapy. Because our family does not believe in that type of stuff, coming from like our background where we try to survive instead of trying to thrive, I guess you could say.
Right.
So they never thought that now that they're not in a civil war, they can start taking care of their mental health, which I started doing, and that brought a lot of opposition towards me and a lot of denial. So that was a lot to deal with. So personally, like I said before, I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but it didn't come from the outside for me. It came from within the home. So that's very unfortunate, I guess you could say.
But that's part of. Sorry, go on, Preet.
Okay. And also, I think mental health is so often de-emphasized within immigrant communities. First of all, because like obviously from that context, like like you said, they're more focusing on survival, and then also within that context, they usually have like these community support networks that like really don't exist within like America, and obviously like people fall through the cracks. Like you have the town alcoholic, or you have the person who's still suicidal. But I think we really just sort of lack that sort of community network in our hyper individualistic culture within America, where, yeah, so many, there is no support network. There's no support network. So many people do need therapy, rightfully so, just because we're so individualized. You're sort of on your own in this world as like the immigrant kid against like a white world that's sort of hostile towards you. And then Aria can go ahead.
I'm glad you went first because you hit on some beautiful points. One, that's one of the reasons I meant to talk about, which is that, like, for me, when I started to learn more about communism, it made sense because I come from a culture where it's a community and people help each other with each other's children, and people, if to this day, if you visit the Azores and you don't have a place to sleep, someone's going to tell you, come sleep at my house, come eat dinner with my family, and they don't have to know you. Right. And that is something that I believe probably all 4 of us have in common, that we come from cultures that do that. So this hyper individualism thing makes less sense when you come from that and you're like, you know, although I can say, like, when I was younger and I wanted to be American, like you were talking about, Ivan, I went through that a lot as well, because I'm queer and I was figuring that out in the 90s, and I was like a punk kid. So I didn't see representations at that time of people that were like POC or immigrants that were in that community. So I tried to distance myself from that. But jumping back, yeah, that idea of culture is something that oftentimes people try to recreate here in the US, but because of the liberalism and indoctrination and bootstrapping and all of that, that you have to sort of take on, I feel like it is corrupted to a degree. And I feel like I mean, obviously it's not really fully allowed, if you want to put it that way, in the US, but also, you know, if you build a group big enough, it's threatening because people start to realize, oh, we don't need some of these things that we've been told we need to be autonomous. And we're getting our needs met in other ways. So, you know, I think about that a lot, and how that's probably why it made so much sense to me, is because I'm like, well, that's what I come from. You know, I may have been born here, but that is the culture that I come from. Mm-hmm. And I think people who don't have that experience, they're further removed from that, you know, either culturally, by generations, or just because they don't have, you know, if they're a white person that doesn't have a connection to their culture. You know, the American culture is not about that, so they don't get it.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me and the mental health stuff, it's external and it's also internal. The internal being like, because my father, you know, went through a civil war and saw some pretty heinous stuff. Like he basically like tried to ignore all like the red flags of being in the United States and where the direction of his life was going. So like as life got worse and I as a child would seek comfort from my father, he basically he would say to me, just get over it. Because he just didn't know how to deal with it. So like from his point of view, and it's sort of his whole world being turned upside down as he lost control of the family and the failed marriage and foreclosure and all that kind of stuff. Like he had 3 children who were Americanized that he could not relate to, who were trying to seek comfort from him, and he just didn't know how to deal with that, and he would just explode and detonate and become violent because his whole thing was, if I just get to the States and I just have the family, my life will be perfect and amazing, and it's not. And it's actually quite remarkable, like sort of seeing like where we're at now, because I struggle to maintain a relationship with him 100%. But one of the last times I saw him and my mother in the same room, which is about a year ago now, or no, yeah, about a year ago now. And I was telling him how, because, you know, you never really, I think, lose that desire to relate to your family, regardless of how things go. I think it's intrinsic to us genetically. I just started talking to my mom and my father about how Collective went and filmed the documentary in DC. And the look that this man gave me, I've never seen him look at me before like this. He just looks so sad because he said, you know, in Spanish, but he said, do you want to be a revolutionary? And I think for him, that was like the moment where like he knows that it was for nothing in a lot of ways for him. And I don't think it is for nothing, but from his point of view, he ran away from the war and now he's in a place where a war is coming. And it's already started in a lot of ways. And here is his son telling him, I picked up a camera and my crew and we went into the thick of it to capture a moment in history to try to contribute to a cause. And I could see in his face, I'm really not trying to be hyperbolic or dramatic, but I could see in his face that he's thinking my son is going to die for something that he believes in.
That is something I also went through. You know, I'm a very open person. I don't really hide anything. I don't have any much fears from me telling what I believe in, talking about what I believe in. So when I started, you know, becoming radicalized, you know, I started thinking about things more and more. I would voice it to my family members and I would ask them, you know, why did you fight? You know, specifically to my uncle who chose to fight for the government. I asked him, why did you fight for them? What was going through your mind as a child when you decided to do this? And I would ask my grandmother and my mother the same thing, since they were part of the rebels. And so I went and asked them all these questions, and they were asking like, why are you so curious about this? And I would just say, like, you know, I'm starting to realize things are not in the best conditions. And, you know, I'm on the side that is possibly going for, you know, how do I phrase this? I'm choosing a path that isn't the most peaceful, is what I told them. And my mother also kind of looked at me and she said in Spanish, like, are you a communist? And I looked at her and I said, yes. And she had a look of kind of like shock, but not she just kind of had a look of like, why? Like, why? Kind of like a, why would you do this? Why
Like a
would
betrayal.
Yeah, kind of like that, where it would be like a, why would you do something like this? I left so that we wouldn't have to fight in a war, and you're basically leading us to one by being opposed to the government. And I looked at her like, if there's something bad, I'm not going to be on the same side of that. I'm just not. Like, you can't change that about me. And that's where like the opposition comes between like a family of immigrants, I guess you could say, from my perspective, where you have your parents who chose to run away from something and in order for their children to have a better life. And when they realized that they ran, they sacrificed their, their relationships back in our home country. They sacrificed their education for them to come here, for all of us to have a better life. And then I think it slowly sinks in after a while that they ran only to end up in the core of the issue that they were running from to begin with.
Yeah.
And it's that unsettling part that I feel like it's not geared towards me. The fact that, like, the fact that I'm choosing to be a communist, it's more geared towards the fact that they're coming to a realization that they ran only to run to the core of the problem. And that at the core, they cannot escape the fact that people like us on the left are going to be fighting for human rights. They just have to come to accept that term. And it's hard for them to come to accept that, honestly.
Because it's related to trauma. Like, we've talked about this a bit, but the cognitive dissonance that happens when you're somewhere where you thought you were doing better for your family and you uprooted your entire life and went to a place where you don't speak the language, and you're now having kids and you're trying to manage what's going on with your kids, but also fit into the mold of assimilation and whiteness and capitalism and all of those things. And meanwhile, not really knowing what they mean, because they really don't mean anything. And then your kids grow up after getting all this education. And by the way, my parents used to always say, and they still do sometimes, oh, you should be learning that in school. Like, they were very naive as to how the American education system worked. And they thought they were teaching us things like emotional intelligence and stuff. Meanwhile, my parents' emotional intelligence and, lack of education in their own country, as well as like the trauma that they endured here that they don't really cope with because they're taught to suck it up like every other person who is not from here, or I guess from here too, that like to go through all that and then have your kid be like, guess what, we should have never moved here. That's
Right.
that's crazy. But it's also like, I mean, I'm a sort of spiritual person in the sense that I view it as we're breaking generational curses. And I think that there's a component that is not often talked about within being radicalized as a communist, that like what we are doing is potentially helping our younger selves or people that are coming up in this now that can come watch this video and be like, oh, I feel heard, I feel seen, and understand that their experiences are not in a bubble.
Right.
Yeah. And one thing I'll definitely say is it's so hard for people to recognize like just how deep like the damage of colonialism is. It's even mental. And like a lot of our parents obviously still live with the survival mechanisms of colonialism, even when the danger is long gone, like within the core of the United States. And Ivan, when you were talking about your issues with your father, my parents went through a divorce too. My dad and I have had very similar issues where, he's still, like, to give a little background, my dad's family was uprooted from their ancestral homeland during Indian partition in the 1940s. Our grandparents were homeless. And so my dad's always been in this sort of survival mode. And even when you no longer really need to survive or survive as hard. And I just think that contributes a lot. Like, colonialism is so much deeper than the actual violence. Like, the ghosts of colonialism live on for a long, long time. And I think in a way, it sort of leads sometimes our parents to have bad conclusions, right? Because like you sort of create like a phantasm within your head where like instead of coming to the logical conclusion of like fuck America, you sort of like double down on it, you know, sunk cost fallacy. Like I spent all this time coming to America and America's evil. Nah, fuck that. You know, my dad's very much fallen into that sort of sinkhole. In fact, I think he told me he's going to vote for Trump. So.
Oh yeah, I got into that battle. My dad's in the Azores. He went back. But you just pointed out something that's true, to the point where they blame you. Like they start to blame their own children. It's like cannibalization in a sense, right? Like you're so invested in it. And like you said, the sunken cost fallacy, we've already lost so much. What more is there to lose? That you start to like blame your children for not living up to this thing that you don't even know what it is, because it's not real.
And not only that, but they came here when they were children. I mean, 18 years old, 19 years old, like,
yeah,
you're a child.
Yeah.
Like, you're not fully developed. You're not even done with puberty. And you like, you did one of the craziest things you could do, which is leave your country, risk life and limb. Crossing the border is not an easy thing to do. People have this misconception that like you just like stroll, which is funny because my father actually did. He thought that it was like a maybe a 10-minute walk. So he told me how he went and bought like a iced tea or something in Guatemala. And he was like, all right, I'm ready. And then it was like a 4-day journey through mountains and rivers and fucking alligators and the federal police looking for people, the American police looking for people, wild animals. Like, it's some real frontier territory. Like, you know, people get winded walking up the stairs. Now imagine walking, you know, hundreds of miles through the wilderness where there's no turning back. Like, and he told me that people in his convoy just straight up disappeared. And he told me, he was like, I hope they were caught by the police, because if they weren't, they died. They died out there. Either they suffered, they, you know, starved to death, dehydration, a wild animal got them, you know, like, it's brutal. And then they get here and then they're like, all right, time to work. They work these, you know, jobs that have demeaning conditions. Oh, but it's okay, but because I have my wife and we'll have a family. And then you have a family, and then conditions in the country get worse. And now there's financial strain. Now you lose the house. Now you lost a wife. Now you have a bunch of kids who you don't relate to. And now they're telling you that they're a communist. And it's like, like it's so bizarre. It really must be from their perspective. As much as I struggle with my father, like that story I told, it fucked me up. I almost just started crying because like I at the end of the day, for all the shit that I give him, I'm like, you know what? Damn, like homie does care about me. But he's so screwed up that he doesn't know how. You know?
I mean, I think there's nothing more than immigrant parents want than you to just keep your head down, not question the system, you know, just become like a little cog in the machine, because it's like almost like sacrificing everything. You know, I think that is their greatest fear. I mean, I personally have like a criminal record. So like anytime I'm trying to like organize or something, or like I'm trying to go to a protest or something, they're freaking the fuck out, and rightfully so, because you know, they sacrificed a lot just to get us here. And even if my mom's the communist, my dad's more conservative. My mom, even if she agrees with the cause, she's like, fuck no, don't throw away your future. Like, don't throw away everything we've invested into this shit. Like, you know, things like that.
Exactly. So yeah, I think, you know, we've been yapping for a while, so I think it'd be good to kind of do our wrap up question here. So like, what would you say? I feel like it's really obvious, but what would you say is like the number one thing that like first generation Americans should do? I mean, one, you should be a communist. I mean, just like through and through. But I think for me, it's that you need to speak up. You need to put yourself on the forefront of these movements, because we're not only talking about abolishing capitalism, we're talking about a national liberation movement of so many people who have been exported to this country to labor in the settler colonial project, where we have no representation. We have very mild civil liberties, but we as a people from India, people from Central America, people from the Azores, people from all over the world really don't have a say. I mean, the workers don't, period, but we don't have a say on top of that as well. We need to start speaking up and talking about how we have our perspective, what it means to be on the other side of imperialism, especially with the likes of the MAGA communists, the ACP, the white supremacists, the people who believe that American hegemony can be maintained as long as we just put a communist sticker on it.
I got some thoughts, but I can wait.
Okay.
Nebula, you want to go first?
Aria can go. I've been yapping a lot.
So the main thing that I thought of was to understand that in bringing class consciousness and reading theory and educating yourself and becoming more militant as a communist, that you have a voice that is special in the sense that you have an inside view and a multifaceted view and life experience where you have seen firsthand and experienced firsthand the ways that capitalism harms people. And that, like, this is something I take as a personal responsibility upon myself to get to know other people's stories and connect with people that need to hear your story and learn about intersectionality and learn about that in the context of Marxist-Leninism, and essentially try to radicalize people and understand some of the psychological conditioning that comes along with that experience, and that, like, you know, you might not be the guy for that person, but you're planting a seed that might sprout at any point, and you have to have this sort of like optimism about it. You know, this is just what I think, and it's like part of the reason that, you know, I've talked to Ivan and Nebula about this topic extensively is because it's what helped me to get to a point where I was like, oh, this shit's fucked the hell up, really, like truly. I've heard that from so many people. It helped me to radicalize myself, so I know that I can help other people, and I know that that's, to me, like what we can bring to it is just educate ourselves as much as possible and get to know our neighbors, get to know the people that we're around and their stories. That's how we can radicalize others.
I think what I want to say is
Let me mute.
You're not alone. Life is treacherous. Life has its ups and downs, and learning, the more you learn about theory and the more that you're radicalized, the lonelier it'll seem, but the more uniting it is as well. I feel like something that I would tell a lot of first-gen immigrants, children or adults at this point, would be to keep reaching out, because even though it seems lonely now, eventually someone's going to reach back out, and you're going to have a community, the community that you've always wanted and always wanted to participate in, and they will be fully accepting of you. I promise. If they're not, then they're not true leftists. They're not true communists. They are not people that you want to be associated with ways. So just keep looking. Just keep looking and you'll find your crew. Trust me. I think I found mine already. And you can find yours too.
At Collective. Shing.
All right.
One thing I'll definitely say is, as a first generation immigrant, you have such a unique perspective. I think, like, for white comrades, like even the best intentioned ones, they've been like sort of swayed by, you know, Americanism and the American hegemony in like ways that weird deviations, like I mentioned before, American Communist Party, anarchism, things like that. And you just bring such a unique perspective in terms of just like, you know, I've had people before tell me like, oh, Marxist-Leninism is like white chauvinist, whatever. And it's just like, no. You don't understand. For my like peasant family, in the Punjab, who didn't even have like a toilet, right? Like didn't even have running water. Like the Soviet Union was liberation. That was freedom. Like
Right.
they're authoritarian, but what you've been taught is authoritarian for the people of the global South is liberation. That is freedom to us. Like what to you has been conceived as oppression, to us is freedom. And I think it's very hard for a lot of people to understand, but the first worlders worst nightmare, the first worlders worst oppression is like the global Southerners' freedom, right? Like it's liberation to them. And I think that's the kind of perspective that you bring. And then other than that, I think I'll just say like it's such a you have such a unique experience, you have such a unique perspective, and especially in America where a lot of the immigrants from communist countries are like the anti-communist elite, right? Like the Vietnamese in South Vietnam or the Cuban Gusanos. I think you as somebody represent just something great as like a communist, and I think you should be vocal about it and just give your perspective as much as you can.
Absolutely. I think the last thing I'll say, is, when it comes to building that political power, Marxist-Leninism, the whole it's white chauvinism nonsense written by white people or whatever, that's such a baby take because they don't understand that there are so many nuances to Marxism-Leninism. There's so many criticisms that Marxist-Leninists have about Marxist-Leninism. But when it comes to taking a philosophy that will give people liberation, is something that these people, particularly white communists, TikTok communists, don't understand. They don't understand because, again, like I was saying in the beginning, they don't know what it's like to not wield authority, not having to be able to do that because they already benefit off of the system. I have said this many times recently, and it sounds arrogant, but when it comes to making propaganda like this, or when it comes to being a communist, when it comes to wanting to perpetuate national liberation, I want to win. We want to win, right? And that requires force, and that requires wielding authority and finally being able to say through the barrel of a gun that we are in charge now. We're in charge of our lives, our destiny, our politics, and our future. And until we're able to seize that, we don't have that future. We have two options, which is either that we take that future for ourselves, or we just be a good little cog in the machine and let this go on and suffer forever and ever and ever. So I think that's where your voice is so important, because these baby leftists, baby communists, white communists, these chauvinists need to understand that they already benefit from political power. We don't. And that's what we're after. All right, homies. So that was great. I'm really happy that both you, Preet, and Nebula came on to yap with us. I think you guys both cooked
Thank you.
gourmet chef's kish.
Unlimited genocide on the first world.
And that's the show.
I'm down with the Imperial Core.
Yeah.
Free Palestine.
Free Palestine. All right, Lumpy, you want to play us out?